Hi there, you are watching Political Dharma with Alan Zundel. Today I'm going to be describing something I call a people's economy. Now, I'm not in love with that term, so after you hear me describe this, maybe you can think of a better one. Welcome your suggestions in the comments below. A people's economy comes out of a long political tradition, and there's been a lot of intellectual work done on the constituent elements of this, as well as some experiments in various parts of the world with some of those elements as well. So, nowhere in any society has it been fully realized, but different parts of it have been in different places. If we want to address any political issues, especially those that touch on economic problems, we have to have an idea, a vision, a model in mind of what society would look like if it were functioning better, if problems were solved, and then a program of how to get there. So last week, I put up a video called "Where Are We Headed?" And in this, I talked about American history in a very simplified form and the various models of how government should be responding to economic issues across that history. And I said what's really driving American history, or has been and still is two things. The fact that we have a capitalist economy means that most of our economic institutions, businesses, have the primary purpose of creating a profit for investors. So this has been a dynamic that's driven economic change and whatever, if we want to call it progress, or if we want to just call it movement, the pursuit of profits has been behind economic developments. At the same time, in politics, not only attempts to manage the economy, but a struggle over how democratic our political system is going to be. That is, how much of a voice ordinary people will have, especially in areas where they feel like their financial fortunes are being affected. Common people have across American history demanded more of a say in the government, especially when they were in economic distress. I came up to the present day in that discussion, and I identified four different types of models of what the government's role in the economy should be. And these are currently in the political discussion at a national level. There is, under Donald Trump, the MAGA movement, which I've called economic nationalism, and then Bidenomics, which has also been called industrial policy because it involves investing in certain types of industries that are meant to be industries of the future or with promise for helping American growth. There's business conservatism, which is essentially the less government, the better, just let capitalism do its thing. And then progressivism, which comes out of the New Deal primarily, wanting to go back to a world in which the capitalist economy is managed and regulated by the government, and also the government does something to move resources from one part of society to another, that is, from the wealthier to those who are in various forms of economic need. Now, I gave an assessment of each of those paths forward and said what their political and economic prospects were, as far as I can tell from my limited view of the world, but my knowledge of history and current politics. And one of the things I didn't emphasize, though, is that all four of those rely on a capitalist economy. And so all four of them are going to be subject to the pressures of businesses seeking profits. And this is the source of a lot of the problems that we face. If investors are continually reaping profits from the businesses they invest in, that means the people already have the greatest wealth are going to be getting wealthier and wealthier and either leaving us behind or even, pushing us further behind if it's taking a lot of the wealth that we already have and moving it up to the top of the income pyramid. So we have growing inequality, which is a threat to democracy because people with wealth have more power over the political system and often want to constrain the ability of regular people to stop them from moving continually in that direction of having more power and money. Even in the case of, let's talk some of the other problems quickly. Of course, profits means you got to keep labor costs and benefits low to the detriment of working people. Sometimes it means offsetting environmental problems. That is, you don't want to pay for them yourself, so you let society pay for whatever damage is caused by your business. And finally, maybe not finally, but another big one is consumers, that we are often paying higher than we should for things. We saw in this recent bout of inflation how some corporations were deliberately raising their prices because they felt the consumer already expects prices to go up. So they're going to go ahead and come in there and raise prices while they can and make greater profits. And also, we become captured by institutions that are continually taking more and more money from us, like insurance or banking fees or credit card fees. So, in a lot of ways, the pursuit of profits can be detrimental to people on a variety of levels, have social costs to them. And even in the case of progressivism, where we're trying to constrict capitalism, it still has those impetuses towards greater inequality and other types of social harms, so that it's like a constant struggle, and eventually the wealthy will push back, as they did going from the 1970s to the 1980s, to dismantle that form of government regulation and government provision of redistributing resources. And so it's a state of constant conflict, and it's also one that tends to what? Well, you make a few steps forward and then several steps backwards, and the dynamic is still there. Now, whenever I criticize capitalism, the first thing people fear is, okay, you're going to present a form of socialism in which the government is going to have more power, and the government is going to try to take control of things, which will limit our individual freedom and perhaps result in an oppressive government. Now, that's a legitimate fear, according to history. Let's look for a minute at a little picture that I've created. And what I've done here is I'm trying to emphasize that it's not only a danger from too much government, but there's also a danger from capitalism itself, especially in its more unrestricted forms. So here I have, when the government is protecting and assisting in the expansion of capitalism, the tendency towards inequality will lead toward or buttress an already existing oligarchy. That is, rich elites will have much more influence over the government than the ordinary person, and it will move more and more in that direction. Finally, the result is they're just going to make democracy an empty term, so that votes don't matter if you're even able to vote, and the wealthy control everything. So it's kind of a fusion of corporate power with government power that in its end result can sometimes be something like fascism under the Nazis. But in general, it means that we could have a totalitarian government of billionaires rather than simply of government functionaries. Now, down there at the bottom, I've mentioned this idea of progressivism and New Deal liberalism, in which the government regulates capitalism and transfer financial resources. If the idea is to try to stay at that midpoint, it's always going to be in a state of back and forth and tension between capitalism and attempts for the government to regulate it, which means big government has to continually be present to try to manage this. And the end result could be, if you take it far enough and have the government involved enough in the economy, it could end up with a form of state socialism like we saw in the USSR or in China, in which the government simply controls economic institutions itself. That's what conservatives often criticize progressives as moving toward. They just want to push it further and further until we finally have something resembling communism in its historical forms. Now, people's economy that I'm going to suggest is different than either of these, in that it gets rid of capitalism, but the aim is to decentralize economic and political power so that we don't have those threats to democracy from either end of the spectrum, the corporate control of government or the government control of all aspects of our economic life. It involves the ownership of private property, but it has two caveats to that. The first one is that rather than have the investors in a business choose who's going to run it, we have the workers running it. They could either choose a board or some other form of self-organizations to run the business. The idea here is that money invested in a business is treated as a loan secured by the assets of the business. So the people working in it are obligated to repay the loan on schedule along with a market rate of interest. But The investors cannot demand that the business function in ways to continually give them the most profit they can get out of it. So it degrades the profit incentive to uphold the incentives of laborers, which could be that they want more money, better lives, but it also they're going to have more concern about the well-being of their communities and their families and the environment surrounding them. So they'll bring in a host of concerns that remote investors who are not directly involved in a business would not be that concerned about. So it's addressing a lot of those social problems at the business level rather than at the governmental level. And the second thing is guaranteed minimum income. We want to set some kind of floor where the government would take from the most wealthy and give to the least wealthy to make sure there was a minimum income achieved by everybody. And there's a variety of ways to do this and a lot of experiments going on with that kind of thing. And then we'd also have a representative democracy similar to what we have now. We're electing people to represent us, but there would be a decentralization and reduction of government powers. Decentralizing means taking power away from the center of the national government, reducing the powers of the presidency, for one thing, and then reducing the powers of the national government in general, moving it more to the state and local level. If we don't have the need to constantly regulate capitalism, we don't have the need for such a big state. A state would be limited to fewer functions, and we'd also be using better voting methods to make sure that we have open competition for elections rather than being controlled primarily by who can raise the most money. So this is the general sense of what the model looks like. Okay, there's private property ownership, but doesn't it include the right for big businesses in particular, for investors to control those businesses? And there would be a guaranteed minimum income. And finally, the political system would have a representative democracy in which power is more moved to the local and state level, and we use better methods of voting. That may be a lot to assimilate, but it is not something that came out of my fevered imagination. There has been a long tradition of working on these concepts and trying to improve them. This is actually a different form of socialism than that which inspired the Soviet Union and China and other communist countries. This, two socialism, two main traditions of socialism, one which traces back to Pierre Joseph Proudhon, who lived from 1809 to 1865, and another that traces back to Karl Marx, who lived from 1818 to 1883. Now, by those dates, you should calculate that Marx was younger than Proudhon. And in fact, Proudhon was a better known socialist thinker than Marx was at the time that Marx was just coming into his own as an intellectual in radical movements. And he read Proudhon's early writings and was influenced by them and later became a critic of Proudhon. But Proudhon, he had more skepticism towards government than Marx did. He had a lot of fear of taking over the state could lead to some kind of oppressive system of government. What he instead saw as a path forward was forming workers' cooperatives where workers actually ran their factories or whatever businesses they were engaged in and formed federations. Later on, others moved this idea forward into what's called syndicalism, which means a system of economy and politics in which unions form, and then workers take over their factories, and then probably by a general strike, they force the government to accept their role, and they would be in charge of producing stuff people need, services and products, and distributing them, and there'd be less necessity for government, so government could shrink. Marx, on the other hand, thought that it was naive to assume that you could build workers' cooperatives successfully in a capitalist economy, and he had a point there, up to a point, I would think. He instead wanted to organize the entire working class into a workers' party. And then the path forward then would be for this party, either in a lot of cases where there was no democratic system in place at the time, through a revolution, this movement would take charge of the state and start instituting the principles of socialism, or in places where elections were possible, such as in England or the United States, the Workers' Party could compete in elections for influence and then gain control of the state that way and institute socialism. And this, of course, is what resulted in trends like democratic socialism, that there would be a gradual path towards this type of socialism by gaining control of the state and gradually instituting power. But it always ended up in most of history in these halfway house between socialism as Marx conceived of it and capitalism as we've experienced it. So there is that tension between the two always in that. So that's the kind of vision that I am proposing as a model of how society could be working differently, coming out of this tradition and modernizing it and adding elements to it. That it is a different way of thinking about things than you generally hear of in the national discussion, a model. But there is, I think, a path forward to something this radical, especially in times like this where people are just trying anything and moving from one party to another, and the parties are fighting within themselves over which vision ought to take precedence. They each have their problems. They've each been tried in history and found wanting in some ways. So I think what the path forward has to be is creating an organization to make more people aware of this particular model of thinking about things and aware of the ways in which these different policy proposals have been tried. There has been an experiment in Yugoslavia in a couple of decades after the Second World War, in which the entire economy of that nation was in a form of workers controlled businesses interconnected with each other. It failed for a variety of reasons, some of them having to do with the way they set it up, others having to do with outside forces. But we also have examples like in Mondragon, Spain. There's a large complex of cooperatives that exist within their larger capitalist society. And we've had other examples of workers' cooperatives throughout history. So, and also a lot of intellectual work done on what an economy like this would be like and how it would function in terms of mathematical modeling and what we should look for. On the other things, we've had experiments with universal basic income happening on a small scale here in this country, and people are much more aware of that since Andrew Yang picked up the idea and promoted it in his presidential run and then in his Forward Party. So a lot of thinking about that already happening and some experiments on a small scale at least. Different types of voting methods that would be an improvement. I've talked about it extensively, and there's been efforts to try to change the way we vote. A lot of different competing ideas for voting reform. Hopefully we can come together on a single path forward about that, but it's something that needs to be talked about as well. And then decentralizing power. All we have to do is go back to the original model of the United States, in which the states were supposed to be primary over the national government, and think through what their roles should ideally be, especially in an economy where you don't have to have government growing to either advance capitalist expansion or to try to restrict capitalism's ill effects on society in general, which is why the national government started to grow bigger towards the end of the 19th century, going into the 20th century, and also that the powers of the presidency have grown over time in order to manage this unwieldy economy and political system that we've inherited. So the way forward then is starting to spread these ideas and educate people about them, form organizations that can promote them, at some point forming a political party, addressing the problems that minor parties, alternative parties have to getting a hearing and having a fair chance to compete in elections. All the things that I've been trying to do through this podcast channel, through my efforts at voting reform, and through my idea of a third-party project in which the various independent candidates and third-party candidates would all compete for an endorsement of a single organization to try to consolidate their support, all that stuff. So just taking things one step further in explaining what I have in mind, and I look forward to your comments on this. Haven't been getting as many comments lately, and I really would like to hear what your reactions are to this, questions, objections, whatever you have to say. You can find out more about my thinking at my website, politicaldharma.com. Not a lot there so far, but some thoughts. I've explained the third party project, and I have a blog in which I occasionally write out my thoughts and give that to people who are on the list for it. Thanks for watching. As usual, if you can, like, subscribe, share this with other people that you think might be interested. And a few more days, I'll be back with some updates on the news, I hope, although there hasn't been a lot of news so far that I've found that I really want to spend too much time on. Okay, enough about that. You'll hear what I come up with when I do. All right. Hope to see you then. Hope you come back. Thanks again for watching. Bye.